The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane soared through the clear blue sky. It was a typical day for most passengers on board Flight 347, traveling from Chicago to Miami. Some were chatting quietly with their seatmates, others scrolling through their phones or flipping through magazines, and a few had already drifted off into naps. Among them sat Emma Carter, a young woman in her late 20s, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below. She had just spent a weekend visiting her father, a man she rarely saw due to his busy schedule, and was now heading back home. Her thoughts lingered on him, wondering when they'd meet again. A few rows ahead, Jack Harper, a tall man with sharp features and an air of quiet confidence, adjusted his seatbelt. A former Army Ranger, Jack had spent years serving his country before retiring to work as a private security consultant. Now, he traveled frequently for work, but preferred to keep to himself. His mind wandered to old memories, missions completed, battles fought, lives saved. But today, there was no room for nostalgia. He simply wanted to get to Miami without incident. As the flight attendants moved up and down the aisle offering snacks and drinks, everything seemed perfectly normal. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they were halfway through the journey and expecting smooth skies ahead. Passengers nodded approvingly, sipping their sodas or nibbling on pretzels. But beneath this calm surface, something ominous was brewing. Emma glanced around the cabin, noticing how diverse the group of travelers was. There was a family with 2 kids laughing softly near the front, a businessman typing furiously on his laptop, an elderly couple holding hands while reminiscing about past vacations, and even a teenager wearing headphones, bobbing his head to music only he could hear. Everyone aboard had their own stories, their own reasons for being here. Little did they know, those stories were about to intersect in ways none of them could have imagined. Jack leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a moment. Flying wasn't new to him. He'd been on countless planes during his military days, but today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the faint vibration of turbulence that had started moments earlier, though the crew assured everyone it was nothing serious. Or perhaps it was the subtle tension in the air, like the world itself knew something big was coming. Meanwhile, Emma pulled out a book from her bag, trying to distract herself from the unease creeping into her chest. She flipped open the cover and began reading, but her focus kept wavering. Every so often, she glanced toward the cockpit door, half expecting someone to emerge with news, or maybe reassurance. Nothing came, just silence, broken only by the steady roar of the engines outside. Then, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere shifted. At first, it was just a murmur, a whisper spreading among the passengers seated closest to the front. Someone asked what was happening. Another replied they didn't know. Soon enough, whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs grew louder until panic bubbled to the surface. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And as chaos erupted inside the cabin, Emma realized this routine flight was anything but ordinary anymore. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain: life would never be the same for anyone on board. The first sign of trouble came when the plane hit a patch of turbulence stronger than usual. Passengers gripped their armrests, glancing nervously out the windows as the aircraft shook slightly. For most, it was just another moment of discomfort they'd experienced before on flights. Nothing alarming. But then, something changed. A muffled thud echoed from the cockpit, followed by silence that felt heavier than the turbulence itself. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She exchanged uneasy glances with the woman sitting next to her, who shrugged and whispered, "Probably nothing." Still, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Moments later, the flight attendants stopped serving refreshments and huddled near the front of the cabin, speaking in low, urgent tones. Their expressions were unreadable but tense, like they were trying not to alarm anyone. Then came the announcement no one wanted to hear. The co-pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, shaky and uncertain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing an unexpected situation in the cockpit. Please remain calm and stay seated with your seatbelts fastened. His words did little to reassure anyone. Panic rippled through the cabin as passengers began whispering among themselves, speculating about what might be happening. Jack noticed the growing unease around him. He leaned forward slightly, his trained instincts kicking in. Something about the tone of the co-pilot's voice told him this wasn't just minor turbulence or a routine issue. It was serious. He scanned the cabin, taking note of the frightened faces, the restless movements, the way people clutched their loved ones' hands tighter. Whatever was going on, it had everyone on edge. One of the flight attendants hurried down the aisle, her face pale but determined. She stopped near Jack's row, hesitating for a second before approaching him. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, leaning close so others wouldn't overhear. "I heard you mention earlier that you're a former soldier. Is that correct?" Jack nodded cautiously, unsure where this was going. "Yes, I served in the army." "Why?" Her voice dropped even lower. "The captain, he's had some kind of medical emergency. We don't know exactly what happened yet, but he's unresponsive. The co-pilot is doing his best, but he's very inexperienced with situations like this. We need someone, anyone, who can help us figure out what to do." For a split second, Jack froze. This wasn't part of any mission he'd trained for. Landing a commercial airliner required skills far beyond those he'd learned in combat zones. Yet, looking into the flight attendant's wide, desperate eyes, he knew he couldn't say no. Lives depended on someone stepping up. And right now, that someone had to be him. As Jack stood up, the other passengers watched in stunned silence. Some looked hopeful, others seemed skeptical. Could this man really save them? Emma, sitting a few rows back, caught sight of him moving toward the front of the plane. There was something steady and resolute in his gait, a quiet confidence that made her believe maybe, just maybe, they weren't completely doomed. When Jack reached the cockpit door, the flight attendant opened it quickly, revealing the chaos inside. The co-pilot, a young man barely out of his 20s, was visibly sweating as he struggled to maintain control of the massive aircraft. On the floor lay the unconscious pilot, his face ashen. The scene was overwhelming, but Jack forced himself to focus. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Outside, the cabin buzzed with nervous energy, passengers clinging to fragments of hope. Inside, the weight of responsibility settled heavily on Jack's shoulders. This was no longer just a flight. It was survival. The days following the emergency landing passed in a blur for Jack. News of his heroic actions spread quickly, with headlines calling him the reluctant hero and the soldier who saved us all. Reporters camped outside his hotel, eager to interview the man who had stepped up when it mattered most. But Jack avoided the spotlight as much as possible. He gave brief statements to officials debriefing the incident, emphasizing that he'd only done what anyone else would have tried to do. Deep down, however, he couldn't shake the feeling that this event, this brush with fate, had changed something inside him. One evening, just as Jack was settling into his quiet routine again, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. Hesitant but curious, he answered. On the other end was Emma, her voice warm and friendly. "Hi, Jack," she began. "It's Emma Carter, from the flight. I hope you don't mind me reaching out." Jack smiled faintly. Of course, he remembered her, the calm woman with kind eyes who had offered reassurance over the intercom. "Not at all," he replied. "How are you doing?" They talked for a few minutes, exchanging pleasantries and reflecting on the surreal experience they'd shared. Then Emma got to the reason for her call. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said. "You saved my life, and everyone else's on that plane. My family and I are incredibly grateful. Would you let us take you out to dinner sometime? It's the least we can do." Jack hesitated. Normally, he would have declined such an offer. He wasn't comfortable being treated like a hero. But there was something genuine about Emma's tone, something sincere that made it hard to say no. After a pause, he agreed. "Sure," he said simply. "That sounds nice. The dinner took place at a cozy Italian restaurant downtown. When Jack arrived, he was greeted not only by Emma, but also by her father, Robert Langley, a tall, distinguished man with sharp features and an air of quiet authority. Despite his wealth and success, Robert carried himself humbly, shaking Jack's hand firmly and expressing heartfelt gratitude for saving his daughter's life. As the evening unfolded, Jack learned more about the Langleys. Emma spoke passionately about her work managing community outreach programs funded by her father's foundation. Robert, meanwhile, shared stories of his own humble beginnings and how he built his business empire through hard work and perseverance. Jack listened intently, impressed by their dedication to giving back to others. At one point, Robert leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Jack," he began, "you remind me of someone who served our country with honor. And now, you've gone above and beyond to serve complete strangers. That kind of character is rare these days." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unused to receiving praise. "I was just in the right place at the right time," he mumbled. Robert shook his head. "Don't sell yourself short. You're exactly the kind of person I want working with us. I run a global enterprise, and security is critical to what we do. We need someone like you, someone with integrity and leadership skills, to oversee operations. What do you say?" For a moment, Jack didn't respond. The idea of stepping into such a high-profile role felt daunting, especially after years of keeping a low profile. Yet, as he looked around the table, at Robert's earnest expression and Emma's encouraging smile, he realized this might be the fresh start he'd been searching for. A chance to use his skills in a new way, to make a difference without carrying a weapon or reliving old battles. "I'll think about it," Jack said finally, offering a small but genuine smile. When the night ended, Jack left the restaurant feeling lighter than he had in years. For the first time since leaving the military, he felt a spark of purpose reigniting within him. And as Emma walked him to the door, thanking him once again for coming, their eyes met briefly, but long enough to hint at the possibility of something more between them. Neither said it aloud, but both knew this was only the beginning. Jack didn't take long to decide. After days of weighing Robert's offer, he realized that staying stuck in the past wasn't helping anyone, least of all himself. The job was an opportunity to step into a new chapter, one where his skills could be put to good use without the weight of combat looming over him. So, with a mix of excitement and nervousness, he accepted the position as head of security for Langley Enterprises. His first day on the job came quickly. Walking into the sleek, modern office building in downtown Miami, Jack felt like he'd stepped into another world. Gone were the rugged terrains and dusty uniforms of his Army days. Now he wore a tailored suit and carried a briefcase instead of a rifle. But beneath the polished exterior, his instincts remained sharp, finely tuned from years of training. As he introduced himself to the security team, he earned their respect almost immediately, not through flashy words, but by demonstrating calm authority and genuine care for their roles. Emma greeted him warmly when they crossed paths later that morning. "Welcome aboard," she said with a smile, handing him a folder filled with details about upcoming projects. "Dad mentioned you're already making waves." Jack chuckled softly, brushing off the compliment. "Just doing my part." Their professional relationship blossomed quickly. Emma often sought Jack's input on community outreach initiatives, valuing his perspective on safety measures. In return, Jack found himself drawn to her passion for helping others. Whether it was organizing charity events or brainstorming ways to support underprivileged neighborhoods, Emma's energy was contagious. Over time, their conversations grew longer, moving beyond work topics to shared stories of life, family, and personal struggles. They discovered they had more in common than either had expected. A deep sense of duty, a love for quiet moments, and a desire to leave the world better than they found it. Robert noticed the growing connection between them and couldn't have been happier. He admired Jack's character and trusted him completely, especially after learning more about his military service and the sacrifices he'd made. To Robert, Jack wasn't just an employee. He was becoming part of the family. And seeing how much Emma lit up around him confirmed what Robert had suspected all along. These two were meant to cross paths. As weeks turned into months, Jack settled into his new role seamlessly. Under his leadership, Langley Enterprises implemented cutting-edge security protocols that earned praise from industry experts. Meanwhile, Emma continued her work with the foundation, expanding its reach and impact across the country. Together, they became a powerhouse duo, balancing professionalism with an undeniable chemistry that neither could ignore. One evening, after a particularly successful charity gala, Emma invited Jack to join her on the rooftop terrace of the venue. The city lights twinkled below, casting a soft glow over the space. For a while, they stood in comfortable silence, enjoying the view. "You know," Emma said finally, breaking the quiet, "I used to think fate was just something people made up to explain coincidences. But after everything that's happened, with the flight, meeting you, working together, I'm starting to believe there's more to it." Jack glanced at her, surprised by her candor. "You really think so?" She nodded, turning to face him fully. "I do. I mean, look at us. We came from completely different worlds. Yet here we are, working side by side, saving lives in our own way. Doesn't that feel meaningful to you?" Jack hesitated, then smiled faintly. "It does," he admitted, "more than I can put into words." In that moment, standing under the starlit sky, something shifted between them. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It didn't need to be. Instead, it was a quiet understanding, a mutual acknowledgement that their lives had intertwined in ways neither had anticipated. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, building not just careers but something far deeper and more enduring. Neither of them knew exactly what the future held, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning of their story. The cockpit was cramped and tense, the air thick with urgency. Jack took a quick scan of the controls, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the unfamiliar dashboard. Buttons blinked in various colors, switches lined panels, and screens displayed numbers and symbols that meant nothing to him at first glance. It was overwhelming. But Jack knew panic wouldn't help anyone. He forced himself to breathe deeply, drawing on years of training that had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. "I'm not a pilot," Jack said firmly, turning to the co-pilot, whose name tag read Ryan. "But I'll do whatever I can to help." Ryan nodded quickly, relief washing over his face for just a moment before it hardened again with determination. "Thank you," he managed, his voice trembling slightly. "We need to get this plane down safely, but I've never done anything like this alone." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he focused on observing Ryan's actions, trying to piece together what needed to be done. Over the radio, air traffic control continued to provide guidance, their voices steady but urgent. They instructed Ryan, and now Jack, on altitude adjustments, speed reductions, and heading corrections. Each instruction felt like another puzzle piece falling into place, but Jack knew they were still far from solving the bigger picture. "Talk me through it," Jack said finally, his tone firm yet reassuring. "Tell me exactly what you're doing and why." Ryan hesitated for only a second before launching into an explanation. He pointed out key instruments, the altimeter showing their height above sea level, the airspeed indicator displaying how fast they were moving, and the heading display guiding their direction. Jack listened intently, absorbing every detail. His military background kicked in, allowing him to process information rapidly and adapt to new challenges. Still, there was no denying the enormity of the task ahead. Outside the cockpit, the cabin buzzed with nervous energy. Passengers whispered anxiously, some praying quietly while others clutched each other's hands. Emma sat rigid in her seat, staring straight ahead, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. She couldn't shake the image of Jack stepping into the cockpit, looking both determined and uncertain. Was he really going to save them? Could anyone pull off something so impossible? Back in the cockpit, Jack leaned closer to the controls, studying the layout more carefully. Okay, he muttered to himself, one step at a time. With Ryan guiding him, he began making small adjustments, following instructions from air traffic control. The plane dipped slightly as they reduced speed, causing a collective gasp from the passengers inside the cabin. Jack flinched but didn't let it distract him. Every movement mattered now. Despite his focus, doubt crept in. What if he made a mistake? What if all his efforts led to disaster instead of salvation? The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than any mission he'd faced in the army. But then he remembered something crucial. He wasn't alone. Ryan was beside him, doing his best despite his lack of experience. Air traffic control was talking them through every move, and somewhere behind him, dozens of people were counting on him to bring them home safely. As the plane leveled out temporarily, Jack allowed himself a brief moment of clarity. He thought about the passengers in the cabin, each with their own lives, dreams, and fears. There was Emma, who seemed kind and strong even in the face of danger. He wondered what she was thinking right now, whether she believed they had a chance. Then he thought about himself, not the soldier or the hero, but the man who had seen too much loss and carried too many scars. If he succeeded today, maybe it would mean something. Maybe it would prove that even after everything he'd been through, he could still make a difference. With renewed resolve, Jack turned back to the controls. "Let's keep going," he told Ryan, his voice steady, one step at a time. And so, surrounded by chaos and uncertainty, two men worked together, strangers united by a shared goal: survival. Outside, the horizon stretched endlessly before them, offering no guarantees. But inside the cockpit, hope flickered faintly, a fragile flame kept alive by courage, teamwork, and sheer willpower. In the cabin, the tension was palpable. Passengers exchanged worried glances, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. Some clutched rosaries or prayer beads, whispering silent pleas for safety. Others held onto their loved ones tightly, as if afraid to let go. The hum of whispered prayers and anxious murmurs filled the air, punctuated by the occasional cry of a child who sensed the unease around them. Emma sat rigid in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white. She tried to focus on her breathing, inhale, exhale, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside her. Her mind raced with questions. Would they make it? Could Jack really land the plane? What would happen to her father if she didn't survive? The thought of never seeing him again brought tears to her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. Now wasn't the time to fall apart. Someone had to keep things together. As the plane dipped slightly again, a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Emma forced herself to sit up straighter, drawing on the resilience her father had always admired in her. Growing up, he'd often told her stories about overcoming challenges, how determination and courage could turn even the darkest moments into opportunities for growth. "You're stronger than you think," he'd say. Today, those words echoed in her mind like a lifeline. Determined to help however she could, Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, ignoring the flight attendant's plea for everyone to remain seated. Moving cautiously down the aisle, she spoke softly to passengers, offering reassurance where she could. "We're going to be okay," she said to a young mother clutching her baby. "The man in the cockpit, he's brave, and he knows what he's doing." Even as she said the words, Emma hoped they were true. When she reached the front of the cabin, one of the flight attendants stopped her gently. "Miss, please return to your seat," the attendant urged, her voice strained but polite. "I want to help," Emma replied firmly. "I can talk to people, keep them calm. Maybe I can even relay messages to the cockpit if needed." The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Just don't wander too far," she said before hurrying off to assist another passenger. Emma took a deep breath and continued her rounds, speaking to as many people as she could. She shared encouraging words, reminded them to stay buckled in, and assured them that everyone on board was working hard to bring the plane down safely. Her calm demeanor seemed to have a soothing effect, and slowly the panic in the cabin began to subside, at least a little. At one point, Emma found herself near the cockpit door. Through the small window, she caught a glimpse of Jack, his face tense but focused as he worked alongside Ryan. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Emma felt a surge of gratitude. Whoever this man was, whatever his story, he was giving everything he had to save them all. Determined to show her support, she leaned closer to the door and spoke into the intercom system nearby, which connected to the cockpit. "Jack," she called softly, hoping he could hear her over the noise of the engines and communication radios. "This is Emma from the cabin. I just wanted to say thank you for everything you're doing. We believe in you." For a split second, Jack paused, his hands hovering over the controls. Then, without turning around, he gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of her words. It was enough to remind him that he wasn't alone in this fight. Beyond the cockpit door lay dozens of lives depending on him, including hers. And somehow, knowing that made the weight on his shoulders feel just a little lighter. Back in the cabin, Emma returned to her seat, feeling a strange sense of connection to Jack, despite barely knowing him. She glanced at the locket around her neck, a gift from her father containing a photo of her late mother. Opening it, she whispered a quiet promise. "If we get through this, I'll find a way to thank him properly." Outside, the sky stretched endlessly ahead, vast and unpredictable. Inside, hope flickered like a fragile flame, kept alive not only by Jack's efforts in the cockpit, but also by Emma's quiet strength in the cabin. Together, though unaware of it yet, they were becoming two halves of a team. One fighting to guide the plane home, the other ensuring its passengers stayed hopeful until they touched down safely. The descent was anything but smooth. Outside the cockpit window, the sky darkened as storm clouds gathered, their ominous shapes illuminated by flashes of lightning in the distance. Inside, Jack and Ryan worked tirelessly, their focus unbroken despite the growing chaos around them. The plane shuddered violently with each gust of wind, and the turbulence made every adjustment feel like a gamble. Passengers screamed as the aircraft dipped suddenly, clutching onto armrests or loved ones for dear life. Jack's hands moved steadily over the controls, his mind racing to process every piece of information coming at him. Air traffic control continued to guide them through the radio, their voices calm but urgent. "Reduce speed to 180 knots, came the instruction. Jack relayed it to Ryan, who nodded quickly before making the adjustment. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. For now. Emma sat rigid in her seat, gripping the locket around her neck so tightly she thought it might break. She tried to focus on breathing, counting slowly in her head to steady her nerves. But the fear was relentless, clawing at her chest with every jolt of the plane. Around her, passengers cried, prayed, and held each other close. A child wailed loudly, adding to the cacophony of panic filling the cabin. Through it all, Emma forced herself to stay strong, not just for herself, but for everyone else. She glanced toward the cockpit door, imagining Jack inside, fighting against impossible odds. What must it feel like, she wondered, to have so many lives resting on your shoulders? Her admiration for him grew with every passing second. If they survived this, she vowed silently, she would find some way to thank him properly, though no words could ever fully express what he was doing for them. Back in the cockpit, Jack felt the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than ever. Sweat trickled down his temple, but he ignored it, keeping his eyes locked on the instruments. "We're almost there," Ryan muttered, his voice trembling but hopeful. Jack didn't respond. He couldn't afford distractions. Instead, he focused on the runway lights visible in the distance, tiny pinpricks of hope cutting through the stormy darkness. As they approached the airport, the weather worsened. Rain lashed against the windshield, reducing visibility to near zero. Lightning struck nearby, momentarily illuminating the entire plane in a blinding flash. For a split second, Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, with sheer determination, he pushed forward, guiding the massive aircraft closer to the ground. "Lower the landing gear," instructed air traffic control. Jack repeated the command to Ryan, who hesitated briefly before flipping the necessary switches. The plane vibrated as the wheels extended, another reminder of how precarious their situation truly was. Every movement had to be precise. There was no room for error. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. With both hands gripping the yoke, Jack guided the plane toward the runway. The wheels touched down with a jarring thud, and for a brief, terrifying instant, it seemed like they might skid off course. But then the brakes caught hold, slowing the aircraft gradually until it came to a complete stop. For several seconds, there was silence. Stunned, disbelieving silence. Then, as realization set in that they were safe, the cabin erupted into cheers and applause. Passengers hugged one another, tears streaming down their faces. Some even knelt in prayer, overcome with gratitude. In the cockpit, Jack let out a shaky breath, his body sagging with relief. Ryan turned to him, his face pale but smiling. "We did it," he whispered hoarsely. Jack nodded, too exhausted to speak. Beyond the cockpit door, he could hear the commotion in the cabin, the sounds of joy, relief, and celebration. He allowed himself a small smile, knowing he played a part in bringing these people home safely. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the plane, ready to assist. As paramedics rushed aboard to tend to the unconscious pilot, passengers began filing off the aircraft, many stopping to thank Jack personally. Emma lingered near the front, waiting for her turn to see him. When their eyes met, she mouthed two simple words: "Thank you." Jack nodded slightly, too drained to say anything back. But in that moment, neither needed words. They both knew it had been a miracle.